Hey everyone, ahla wa sahlan fikum. In the very first video I made for this channel, I talked about how the writing and pronunciation of Palestinian Arabic differs from that of Standard Arabic. I never really revisited that topic, but many people have asked me since then to discuss pronunciation in more detail. Well, I've decided to finally address the pronunciation of Palestinian Arabic with a series of 4 videos. Total beginners can expect to get useful tips for the actual pronunciation of the tougher sounds found in Arabic, but I'm also going to address the more technical aspects that are usually not explained. As you know, Arabic writing almost never marks vowels, and that ambiguity is even more prominent in the dialect. But there are underlying strong patterns regarding syllable types and word stress that I'm going to explain too, so advanced learners will hopefully get better at accurately reading and pronouncing words they haven't seen before. In the first 2 videos, I go sound by sound. In the first video, I focus on consonants, and in the second video, I cover vowels, explaining how each one is pronounced, but also where, when, and why they occur. In the following 2 videos, I discuss overall words rather than single sounds. In the third video, I talk about phonotactics, which covers the types of sound combinations and syllable types that are possible in Arabic. I know it sounds complicated, but with a few easy tricks, you'll be able to quickly read words you've never seen before, which is otherwise difficult in Arabic. The fourth and final video is about stress. Word stress, I mean. Knowing and predicting where the stress goes in a word is really important to pronouncing it properly and can even make a difference in the word's meaning. So, without further ado, let's get started with today's topic. Okay, so today we're going to start our discussion with consonants. First, I'm going to quickly run through the sounds that are common in many different languages, since we don't really need to spend a lot of time on those. Then I'm going to actually give you some tips about how to pronounce the more unfamiliar sounds in Arabic. But as we go through each sound, I'm going to be reviewing many of the points I made in the very first video of this channel, where I told you that certain consonants are pronounced differently in Standard Arabic versus Palestinian Arabic, so stick with me. Anyway, I'm going to do this very vaguely in the order of the Arabic abjad, but in reality I'm going to mix it up a little bit for the sake of making certain explanations more clear. Also, as I said, we're going to do the easy letters first and then come back to the tougher ones. Okay, let's get started. Ba, aba, ab, ta, ata, at. Ja, aja, aj, da, ada, ad, ra, ara, ar, za, aza, az, sa, asa, as, sha, asha, ash. Okay, now I'm going to skip a bunch of letters. Fa, afa, af, ka, aka, ak. La, ala, al, ma, ama, am, na, ana, an, ha, aha, ah. This is obviously like a normal H in English, but in certain scenarios, especially when it's used as a suffix for huwa, it's so soft that it's almost inaudible. Instead, what happens is it shifts the emphasis in a word. So for example, khalli becomes khalli. More on that on the video on word stress. And of course, finally, we have wa, a wa, and ya, a ya, which are the 2 consonant vowels in Arabic. Before we move on to the tough letters, there are 2 more sounds that aren't very difficult per se, but are used differently in the dialect. Tha, a tha, ath, tha, a tha, ath. Each of these has 2 alternatives in the dialect. Tha can be pronounced as ta or sa, and tha can be pronounced da or za. Notice that these are all voiced, unvoiced pairs. Tha, tha, ta, da, sa, za. But which way should you pronounce these letters? Well, it depends. I've heard it says that these letters are pronounced sa and za for standard Arabic words, and they're pronounced ta and da for words that are mainly in the dialect. I haven't personally verified this scientifically or anything, but I do think it's a useful idea to keep in the back of your mind, even though it's a bit subjective and not always that simple in reality. But here's what I can say about this. As for tha, I would say that in Palestine there's free variation in the use of tha and ta, meaning that you can pronounce this letter in either of these 2 ways. The actual letters are interchangeable in spelling too, and certain words that aren't even written with tha anymore, like ba'at, which originally comes from bath. These types of words are of course pronounced exclusively with ta at this point. Anyway, while this letter can also be pronounced sa, this is not universal and doesn't work for every word. And you also can't replace the letter tha with the letter sin. For example, you can say mathalan, matalan, or masalan. But the word thum is either thum or tum, not sum. As for the, this sound is rare compared to the. So even though some people say thum or thani, in the urban dialects you don't hear that at all. On the other hand though, both da and za are common pronunciations of this letter. However, they're not necessarily interchangeable, and instead it's usually one or the other depending on the word. For example, idha is pronounced iza, whereas I've never heard ida. On the other hand, dhuq is du, whereas I've never heard zu. However, it's common to actually substitute the letter dal with dal in these cases. So the word du is actually spelt with dal, which makes things a little bit less ambiguous. Okay, that covers the easy letters. Now let's see how we pronounce the rest. Let's start with these two since they're not that complicated. Kha, akha, akh, gha, agha, agh. Some of you may be familiar with the kha sound already since it does exist in a lot of languages. It's almost like rolling an R, ra, but with the middle of your tongue, kha. And do make sure that you feel the middle of your tongue scratching against your soft palate, because I know some people hear the sound and they try to do something down here. Don't worry, we'll get to the throat, but this one is with the middle of your tongue, kha. As for gha though, this one is much easier than you think because it's actually just the voiced version of kha, gha. So as you're doing the kha sound, start letting out your voice. That combination of kha plus voice gives you gha. Now, there is a gradient to this one, because now that you're letting out your voice, as long as you have your tongue in the proper position, you don't actually need to trill to make this sound. Check it out. So there's some free variation here. Some people trill more, gha, some people don't at all, gha. The important takeaway is that kha and gha are articulated in the exact same location. Okay, next we have ha, aha, ah, ah. You're probably not going to believe me at first when I say this, but these two sounds are also just voice and devoice versions of each other. So your throat is in the exact same position, and the only difference is that when you say ha, you're not letting out your voice, but when you say ah, you do let out your voice. So if you're doing it right, all you have to do to switch between these two letters is turn your voice on and off. Check it out. Ha, ha, ah, ah, ha, ha, ah, ah. Obviously the issue for many of you will be finding the right space to begin with. They say that to make the sound you have to constrict your throat, but obviously that's a bit of a vague explanation. I would say that I feel the constriction right about here, where this thing is. In fact, when I constrict my throat, you can actually see this thing go up and choke me. Ha, ha, ha. Just practice constraining in various spots around here until it sounds right. Again, the good news is that once you isolate that spot and that motion, it's not really a difficult sound to make. Plus, it's the same articulation for both sounds. Ha, ah. So once you think you have it, make sure you just turn your voice on and off to make both sounds. If you can make both sounds without moving at all, then you're definitely doing it right. Just one thing to remember about ah is that it's not a vowel, it's a consonant. So don't move your lips or anything trying to make the sound in isolation. It's when you actually release the sound that you're going to want to form your vowels. So try to say abi, aila, umr, oud. Okay, now let's do qa, aqa, aq, a. Okay, first of all, don't worry too much about pronouncing qa. In the dialect, this sound is mostly replaced by other sounds, which I'll talk about in a moment. Sometimes words that are more formal, though, do conserve this sound. For example, the word maqale, meaning article, or qaran, meaning to compare. The sound is similar to a ka, except that ka, like kha, uses the middle of your tongue against your soft palate. Instead, qa uses the back of your tongue tapping against the very back of your palate, like this. Ka, 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 qa, qa, qa. Anyway, I'm not going to dwell too much on this because it's a rare sound in the dialect. As I said, it's usually replaced by 3 different sounds. The first possibility is actually a regular ka, as in kalb. This sound is common in villages, but I recommend against it unless you're fully committed to having a village accent, because then you would actually have to turn the actual k's into ch, as in bakullach. Another possible pronunciation of qa is as a ga. This is actually how it's pronounced in all the Gulf countries, and it's also common to say it this way in Jordan. In Palestine, though, it's less common and is more specifically associated with the Bedouin community. But I mean, it is used, so just keep that in mind. In towns and cities, though, the common pronunciation is as a hamza, as in ba'ullak. Now, what is a hamza? It's basically an abrupt stop, as in uh-oh. You basically just cut yourself off suddenly. At the beginning of words, it doesn't really make a difference, so the word qalb is just alb. But it does make a difference in the middle of words and even at the end of the words, as in bati or even the simple la. In fact, the word for no in the dialect should be pronounced this way. La, not la, la. Alright, now your favorite, the pharyngealized consonants. Also known as the emphatic consonants or the dark consonants. These are some of the toughest sounds for non-Arabic speakers to pronounce, mainly because people are unclear about what's actually the difference between these and these. Let's try to hear it first. Ta, ata, at. Ta, ata, at. Sa, asa, as. Sa, asa, as. Da, ada, ad. Da, ada, ad. Tha, adha, ath. Va, ava, av. I'm sure anyone can tell that there is a difference, but you may just not know how the sound is being made. Well, it's actually way easier than you think, and if you speak English, you actually already know how to do it. Instead of going through each letter one by one, I'm going to teach you the overall principles that govern the pronunciation of all these letters, because if you can say one of them, you can say them all. Okay, so to start pronouncing these letters, we're going to start with their normal counterparts, and then modify them to produce the pharyngealized versions. So start by saying the letter ta, ta. Now, there are two main modifications we're going to perform to make the tha sound. The first thing that's really important that people underestimate is just how much of the work is actually being done by the vowels around the letter. Listen again. Ta, 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 ta. I'm going to talk about this more in the video on vowels, but for now keep in mind that an important part of pronouncing these letters is just to bring that vowel back from an a to an a. Ta, ta, sa, sa. So as you're practicing this letter, you can sort of cheat your way to sound more authentic by actually making sure that you get that vowel in. Okay, now for the actual articulation. As I said before, these are called pharyngealized consonants, which is a very fancy term that means that while you are saying the letter, the back of your tongue is raised up to the soft palate. Okay, so what the heck does that mean? Because I know it's confusing. Fortunately for English speakers, there's actually already a pharyngealized letter in English. In fact, these Arabic letters aren't the only sounds that can be pharyngalized. Technically, a language could have basically any of its letters pharyngalized. So in English, it just so happens that even though most people don't realize it, the letter L is pharyngalized. Let's compare the Spanish word la to the English word law. La, law, la, law. Doesn't law sound a bit like ta, sa, and da? That's because the English L is articulated in the same exact way as these Arabic letters, with pharyngalization. So now, to actually make these Arabic letters, what we're going to do is start by saying the letter la. L. That way you don't have to think about putting your tongue in the right position because you're going to do it automatically. So try to say the word love. Now say it again, but this time hold the L. Now your tongue should be in the pharyngalized position. Plus, the tip of your tongue should be on your teeth, which is exactly where we need it to say the letter ta, sa, da. So what you're going to do is stop voicing the L, but don't move anything and freeze your mouth. Okay, so now let out your beautiful voice and say the letter da. Da. So if you didn't move your tongue at all and you kept it in the L position, you should be hearing that dark sound. That's the da. Now try to give us ta, ta, ta. Now try to say them back to back. Da, da. Ta, ta. The sa may be a little bit trickier since the way of pronouncing an L is a little bit different from where your tongue needs to be to say the sa. So practice first with da and ta, and once you think you have a feel for what your mouth is supposed to be doing, move on to sa, sa, sa. Now you've probably noticed I haven't said va in my examples. That's because this letter is actually not said like this in the dialect. Remember that that is pronounced as either da or za in the dialect? Well, it's the same for va. In the dialect, it becomes either da, or it actually can become za, a pharyngalized za, which actually doesn't have its own letter in Arabic, so it's an original new sound. Also, in the same way that that is often just written as da altogether, there are many cases where a da actually represents an original va, as in dal or nidhara. Otherwise, if you do see the letter va, go ahead and pronounce it as za, as in muwazzaf. Now let's practice these now. Sa, 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 saw, za, zaw, za, zaw. Anyway, the takeaway is that pharyngalization is something you do independently from the main articulation of a letter. So any letter can be pharyngalized as long as you just bring up the back of your tongue, the way that you do with the letter L in English. Now there's one last implication to this that's good to know. In real life, letters aren't just pronounced independently from each other. They occur in real words and next to other letters. So your tongue is constantly moving into lots of different positions to articulate these sounds. So what happens in reality with pharyngalization is that when there's a pharyngalized letter in a word, usually all the letters around it become pharyngalized too. This actually makes it much easier, because the point is that in a word like this one, for example, you don't say it as na and then bof. That requires a lot of maneuvering. Instead, the whole word is pronounced with that pharyngalized sound, moddaf. Na becomes ma, moddaf. I say this in hopes that it will actually make things easier for you because you basically don't have to overthink the pronunciation of every single letter individually, but rather you can approach syllables and words as a unit. Okay, take a deep breath because we're finally done with consonants. I really hope this has been helpful, and I'll see you in the next video where we're going to talk about vowels.
اهلا حبايبي وشكرا للجماعه اللي بيحضروا القناه. اذا بدكم تكملوا تشوفوا هالفيديوز اعملوا سبسكرايب، واذا شفتوني مؤخرا تفضلوا روحوا شوفوا الفيديوز الماضيه بالبلاي ليست، وتذكروا اني عملت مصادر لتعلم اللهجه الفلسطينيه تقدروا تلاقوها بالموقع تبعي اللي مكتوب تحت بالديسكربشن، ونشوفكم المره الجايه.